David Platt, his book Radical. I read that too. I'm like, right, yeah, I can get behind this. So anyway, so that was kind of my upbringing. Believed all of it. And long story short, through several different major cataclysmic events in society, Trump, Black Lives Matter, and COVID, I essentially saw that there were such problems in my own tradition that I had to renegotiate. What do I believe about God in the Christian sense? I just had too many questions and things weren't adding up. And I wasn't following the cultural perspective that a lot of my peers shared around Trump and how we handle COVID. And I'm like, something doesn't feel right here. So I started the New Evangelicals on social media, and that kind of took off in 2020, in December of 2020. And now I do this work full time talking about this stuff. That's kind of the nutshell version, to be honest.
Wow. So that's relatively recent.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I mean, big, like, I'm not just the podcast part of it, but I guess even the outworking of what you're believing about the world, I would say it's relatively recent. Is that wrong to say?
It's kind of both. And, there were 100 micro things that were going on for years I had questions about. I mean, some were theological. So I grew up in a more Calvinist understanding, right? So I would think to myself, I understand what I've been taught about tulip theology and stuff, but I'm supposed to believe that God is good and loving and just, but also has predestined people to go to heaven. And like, there's just nothing that we can do about it. Like, it's determined. And so my brother who's not saved, he's going to burn forever. I'm predestined to go to heaven, and somehow I'm going to enjoy wherever this heaven is while my brother's burning. I'm like, things like that stuck with me. And then we had like sillier things. Like, why are we always waging war on Starbucks during Christmas time? That feels kind of silly. And then I also realized that people in my tradition were really brutally mean towards gay people. Now, I myself at the time, I was not affirming. I was still very much like the Bible was clear, but even I could see like, well, these people aren't Christians. Why are we holding them to this standard that I don't think is necessary, considering that all they're asking for is the same legal rights in the pluralistic society? So I always had questions, and I always was wrestling through these things. I think Trump was the final crack in the dam where I was like, you know what? Something is so wrong with my own tradition. I gotta think more critically in an effort to be more faithful to Jesus. So all of my work, even today, is out of me having allegiance to the way of Jesus as best as I know how at any given time.
Wow, man, there's a good amount in that one.
Just a little bit.
There's a good amount. Now, let me tell you this, Tim.
Yeah, go ahead.
I've had the pleasure of being able to have conversations. And because we're in the United States of America, majority of them start with a pretext of Christianity in some type of way. In some type of way. And the one thing I've found in common with those who have at least deviated from the biblical doctrine that we follow and acknowledge is the preface is always that I was legit gung-ho, really for it, did all this stuff. Why do you think that is? That's an open-ended question on purpose. I mean, what do you think is relating you all in that?
Can you give me the doctrine that you're talking about? What doctrine?
Oh, no. I'm saying people who have deviated from
like
any biblical doctrine. So
yeah, like which one?
You implied that you're homosexual affirming now?
I am queer affirming, yes.
Yeah, so I'm not. I believe the Bible teaches that marriage belongs to man. Woman, sex is a thing that belongs in marriage. And so so that's an example. But I think there's probably a few more that we disagree on.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
So that's all I was speaking generally.
More broad. Okay, sorry.
Yeah,
I didn't know it was specific. Yeah, I mean, everyone's story is different. This is when we get into the kind of the deconstruction explosion. I will tell you the people that I tend to represent and the ones that I work with the most, a lot of it is just, it was actually a curiosity. It was like, is this, and insert any conversation, is this how the Bible functions? Am I supposed to believe that the earth was formed in a literal 6-day creation story? What does that mean? And so people just end up having a lot of questions. And then more importantly, because oftentimes the critique is, well, the church wouldn't hold space for my questions. I have not found that to be the case. The church is very open to hearing your questions, as long as you come to their answers. That was the problem. Once I started coming to different conclusions about, any issue we're talking about that we're going to disagree on, all of a sudden I found a wall that said, oh, well, you're beyond orthodoxy, whatever else you want to call it. I think there's I think that, to be succinct, and I don't want to overtalk here. I appreciate you asking.
Hey, you're on here to talk, baby.
To really put it clearly, I think that there was a disconnect between the lived reality that we were experiencing and seeing and how we were taught to understand the Christian tradition and the Bible and what that meant. Something was at odds where it wasn't syncing. It wasn't making sense. And so at least for me, I was just curious. I wanted to dig deeper into the text. I wanted to read other theologians, other Christians. What are these texts talking about? What is the Bible? How do we get it? Why these books and not the other books, right? Of the Bible that were canonized. Those questions just led me to realize that this Christian tradition is way bigger than I was ever led to believe. And once you have that, at that point, why am I going to hold such tight boundaries around things that many Christians don't and have a better answer for than what my tradition gave me?
So yeah, I mean, thank you for sharing that. I think that some of those boundaries are real, but nonetheless man-made, are they not? Man-made boundaries. So even a nature versus nurture type of thing, where your specific context, those boundaries exist. I'm sure there are Christians with similar boundaries. I mean, especially you shared about your upbringing. It was homeschool, private school, Calvinist context. And so I understand that. However, what about those who didn't have those boundaries and have come to have drawn different conclusions? And so, for an example, I want to know what you think about the scriptures. What is the Bible? You asked that question, what is the Bible? How do we get it? Well, where do you land in that question?
Well, I mean, it seems like best I can tell from reading as much as I've read so far, and of course, this can always change as I read more. It seems like the Bible that we have today came through quite the process, right? I mean, we both know this stuff, right? We had none of the original manuscripts, things like that. That to me isn't problematic. That's just the reality of things. But it's been interesting just reading how we got our modern Bible, all the processes that go into it, what we do know about the text that we have, what we don't know. I mean, maybe to quote, I'm not sure how you all feel about the Bible Project. That's Tim Mackey and those folks. I find them to be pretty moderate overall. And, Tim Mackey will tell us that, a lot of the letters that we have, for example, of Paul are only half the conversation. So we're doing our best to kind of make sense of what is Paul talking about, right? So I find the Bible to be a beautiful, complicated, oftentimes perplexing collection of texts that I believe are inspired. They are sacred in a very unique way. But I would not hold to the evangelical notion of inerrancy, meaning the Bible. I would reject the Chicago statement on biblical inerrancy, to be very specific.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, now, all right. So let's do some Inspector Gadget work. You use the word inspired.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? Because we mean something different when we say inspired.
I believe that God has spoken through a unique way in the scriptures.
And what does that mean?
Like Jesus, right? The 4 gospel accounts. I think Jesus is God incarnate. He represents what God is like embodied as a human, right? So these 4 gospels that we have, I believe, were inspired by God to give us what we have today to emulate the life and teachings of Jesus, as one example.
Now, why do you trust that? Or how have you come to that conclusion about Jesus?
What do you mean?
I mean, whatever you just said, that Jesus is embodied God.
Yeah.
And let's just start there. Why do you believe that about Jesus?
I believe that because I believe that's what the Christian tradition essentially has come to the conclusion on regarding the Trinity. So I hold the Trinitarian beliefs, meaning Father, Son, Holy Spirit, etc. And I choose to believe that Jesus is the incarnate being of God. And with that gives me a sense of, okay, well, if this is what God is like Jesus, I have an obligation to model my life after this Jesus person. I mean, after all, I am a Christian, right? So I want to embody the little Christ ethic that we see in the 4 gospel accounts.
Yeah. You're going to have to cut me off if you have questions.
Okay.
I'm just So yeah, I get that. I was asking, the reason I asked that question was because you said you don't believe the Bible is inerrant.
That's right.
Right. So that means that we can't really trust any of it, because then at any point we're picking and choosing which part is making mistakes and which parts aren't. How do we know which parts are making mistakes? And do we have any evidence that it's made that mistake?
Well, just so we're on the same page, why don't you define how you understand inerrancy? Because there are literally several different major views of inerrancy, right? So
that's true.
For you, how would you think about it?
No, that's a great clarification. So yeah, you'll have like a a Bart Ehrman that talks about the variables and everything else,
Mhm.
right? But then he
Yeah.
also will conclude that the variations throughout Scripture do not touch the profession of Scripture, the single profession of the gospel of who Jesus is, biblical doctrine at all. It doesn't touch it at all. And
Yeah.
so what I mean by inerrancy is that we can learn about the world, about the maker of the world, about who we are, and answer those 4 pillar questions of any worldview any worldview needs to be built upon, of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny, specifically within a biblical context, with all truth. We can answer those questions truthfully with no mistake at all.
Interesting. I would definitely. I mean, I follow a lot of Bart Ehrman's work. I've had him on the podcast. I definitely would agree with Bart because he's a scholar and I'm not. But yeah, I mean,
Agree with what part?
what you just said, like there are tons of variables, but they really don't touch any core doctrines
Yeah.
ultimately
Oh,
about
yeah,
like
yeah,
what
yeah.
Christians believe,
Mhm.
But again, like I mean, maybe we have a different understanding of, or I'll just say how I was taught about inerrancy was that
Mhm.
the Bible does not contradict. There are no errors in it. There are no flaws in it, and that's just not the Bible that we have. Like you
Oh,
can,
I would agree that's the
yeah,
case.
yeah. So
Which I mean, I'm sorry, I would agree that that statement of inerrancy, but then we'd have to like crack open flaws and error. That's the game, but that's the game, right? That's the game. We got to crack
yeah,
open what flaws and errors mean. So, what contradictions would you like? Give me an example of a
yeah,
contradiction.
I mean, one easy one that would not have any serious bearing on either of our beliefs would be, of
Mhm.
course, it's a very classic example, is the story of how Judas died and how the field was named after him, right?
Okay.
And this is a very I mean, Answers in Genesis gives their answer to this, right? So they say, listen, here's the bottom line: Judas, in one narrative, hangs himself. In another narrative, his guts spill, he falls headlong, his guts spill out. And then
Mhm.
there's 2 different stories about how the field was named. One story is that the field of blood was named after Judas dying. The other one was named after what the chief priest called it, essentially.
Mhm.
And so what I'm saying is that in the text, unless you create a new scenario that would reconcile that thing, like for example, Answers in Genesis says, well, here's how we reconcile it. It's very simple. You see, Judas hung himself. He got so bloated, and
Mhm.
eventually the tree fell, and then his guts spilled out headlong. Right. So
Mhm.
you could say that's reconcilable, but that's nowhere in the text. You have to make up a story and
Yeah.
assume by using outside logic or reason or whatever, however we would think about this, to
Mhm.
make it no longer a contradiction.
Yeah.
And
I
there are
agree.
other examples of
Well,
that too.
let me just interject there. I think the only reason that, kind of rationale exists about those contexts, the context of Judas, which we're talking about Luke's record, right?
I believe
And
it's Matthew and I believe it's Acts. I could be
yeah, Luke.
mistaken.
That's what I meant.
Yeah.
Yeah, Luke did Acts.
Oh, right. Yes,
Yeah.
correct. Sorry.
And so, he's a physician. He's a physician. He's describing things based on a physician's point of view. But the only reason people have entered into that type of thinking is because claims like contradictory have come up. So before we even look at the claim, I think that that claim of contradiction is false. A contradiction, technically, is that A can't both be A and non-A at the same time. And that's not what you see in the text. I think that would be an example of Matthew saying Luke hung himself. And in Acts, Judas. Matthew saying Judas hung himself. And then Luke writing in Acts that Judas never hung himself. That is a textbook contradiction. That is irreconcilable. You cannot rationalize your way out of that. That is a contradiction. But to
Mhm.
say that Judas hung himself and then to say that he fell headlong and his insides burst open, that's not a contradiction. Both could be true.
How would they
Wouldn't you
both be
agree?
true? In with just the text, with just remember the claim is the Bible isn't errant, has no contradictions.
Correct.
Not
Yeah.
using any outside reason or making up your own story. How would those 2 things be reconcilable on the surface?
It reconcilable on the
Yeah,
surface?
meaning if I tell you, hey man, I have to cancel tonight.
Mhm.
My son got hit by a car, and then
Mhm.
tomorrow I tell you, hey, I'm sorry to cancel. My son fell down the stairs, and you'd be like, well, which one is it? Did he get hit by a car? Did he fall down the stairs? I'm like, no, that's not a contradiction. You don't understand that both are true at the same time. So you tell me, did he fall headlong and his guts spill out, or did he hang himself? They're completely different scenarios. Entirely.
Well, they are different scenarios. And here's an example. Instead of using you as both accounts, let's do a better analogy here.
All right, let's go. I'm ready.
Because we have Matthew and we have Luke. So those are two different people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's use you and your son, which is, do you have a son? You have a son?
Actually? Yeah.
Oh man. Why'd you use him?
I love my son. Let's understand. I love my kids so much.
Sheesh.
Sorry.
Okay. Well,
don't clip that. Okay, I'm in a lot of trouble.
So let's say that you and another gentleman saw a little boy get hit by a car. Now, the little boy got hit by a car. You saw that. A gentleman down the stairs saw the boy fall down the stairs after getting hit by a car. That's still, and then you're both reporting on it. Those aren't contradictions. They aren't contradictions, and they can both be true.
Audience decide. I don't understand what. Maybe expound on that. Say it one more time so I can really try and grasp it.
I mean, like any, I don't know, freaking subway, metro area. You have stairs, right, on a street level.
Sure.
And so let's see if someone gets hit by a car. You see them getting hit by a car. You report it as such. They got hit by a car. But someone downstairs, after the person gets hit by a car, happens to fall down the steps. That's what their report is, that they fell down the steps. Now, that could very well happen. They could very well have seen it. You could very well have seen yours, and you could both account the same event and not have contradictory accounts. They both happened.
There's only one flaw.
What's that?
Well, you're assuming that Luke and whoever wrote Matthew, we don't know who it was, saw the same event at the same time and recorded it the same way.
Well, no, I'm not assuming that.
In your analogy, you are, right?
Well, what I was dismantling your analogy through that analogy. So let me get back to the thing. So now with this, I think the reason that Luke is reporting, or the reason we have Luke's report the way we do, is because there are aspects about his reporting that are, I guess it's just different from Matthew's. And the fact that it's different doesn't make it contradictory. And so you're saying, well, why would Answers in Genesis ever have that type of conclusion? Because they're bringing up outside logic. Well, outside logic, I don't really know what that really means. I think when we're reading and interpreting things, we're using logic no matter what. Hermeneutics is logic. And so the question is, well, why would Matthew say he hung himself? And why would Luke say that he fell headlong and burst open? Why would they do that? Now, the technical answer is we don't know why they recorded it that way. But we also know that they are not, by definition, contradictions. They're not contradictions.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure where to go with that. I would let the audience just read those two passages and just look at everything that does not is not both cannot be true at the same time. Again, what I meant by the logic thing was the only way it can be true at the same time is if you insert a reason outside the text to make them reconcilable. So the claim is always the Bible is inerrant. It can't contradict. And what I'm trying to point out is that unless we use interpretation or some outside force on the text to reconcile those things, there's no way to do that. So if I gave someone this book and said, read these two accounts, which one is true? They would go, I don't know. Okay, well, what if I told you, think about it like this. Oh, now I see how you get there. That's what I'm trying to point out, because I was always taught that like the Bible in and of itself is inerrant and therefore can't contradict and has no flaws and no errors. But there are those things on the surface, at least. And by the way, for me, these are not issues at one bit, because I don't think that the biblical authors, especially the gospel authors, are the most concerned about what I would call as the camcorder footage. They're concerned about much bigger issues. So to me, these contradictions, whatever you want to call them, these different accounts of the same story aren't a problem. But for the inerrantist, they pose as a problem to be fixed. Oh, we can't have them like this. We have to reconcile them somehow. So we'll use this analogy or that analogy, or we'll use the, Judas was bloated and then his guts spilled out. Oh, okay, you could do that, but I don't see a reason to make up an imaginary scenario to make them reconcilable.
Well, I think that, you're familiar with J. Warner Wallace, right? Are you familiar with J. Warner Wallace?
I don't think I am.
He's a former atheist, cold case detective turned believer, has written some books.
Did Sean McDowell interview him recently? Sounds like he did.
You know what? He did, actually.
I saw the name, but I don't know who he is.
Silver hair.
Okay, yeah.
So, they have to fill in blanks. you know, and they're not trying to make something up to appease themselves. They're filling in blanks that are missing train tracks to the tracks that they have that needs to fit the puzzle. I just used a bunch of different train tracks and puzzles.
I don't get that one.
but you get what I mean.
That one's rough.
You get what I mean.
Yeah.
But I mean, they're not just trying to throw something in there so the train can move across. It has to be the track that fits there. And so what people are doing with Luke's account in Acts is they're using logic, which is a very necessary thing. I think logic ought not deceive us. That's why we have things like logical fallacies. We have inconsistencies. We have presuppositions so that we can have red flags that say, hey, you're actually going the direction of non-truth and that type of thing.
Yeah.
And so in Luke's account, it makes sense that if someone did hang themselves, and then we also have background context. It's a Jewish context. It's a dead body. And we're talking about holy season. No one's touching it. No one can remove it. It has to stay there. Things can happen to a body when it's not touched and it's dead. I mean, all of that stuff are logical consistencies. It needs to be consistent. It needs to be coherent. So you can't just throw stuff in there because then even the logic would say, rah, rah. These are inconsistencies. What do you have to that?
Well, I mean, I don't disagree. I would just say that we can still both agree that it's still speculation, right? We don't actually know. We don't know for sure which one it could have been. Is that fair to
100. No, that's very fair to say. Oh,
right.
Wait. You almost trapped me. What do you mean?
Oh, I'm not trying to trap you.
No,
what I mean is like in the case of this story that we're using as an example, right?
Yeah.
One hypothesis could be answers in Genesis hypothesis, right? That he got so bloated, the tree broke, his guts spilled out. Sure, that's a one solution. Another solution could be what you just said, right? Where hey, depending on what angle you saw this happen from, both could be true. I'm just saying we both agree though we actually don't know which one it is. We're still speculating what it could have been. We don't actually know.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
It's sort of fair to say because it's almost a concession that it's still either or by definition. And I think that's what our disagreement is. It's not either or. It can be both and.
Well, it could be, but it also could be either or. It could be either. We don't know. Is what I'm trying to say. Like how would you prove that to me that no, it actually is both and, Tim?
Yeah,
like, what would be the level of proof you would give me before you could say, definitively, sorry, Ken Ham, you're wrong. That example is bad. This is the right one. How would you do that with a book that is
Ken Ham doesn't disagree with that.
What?
You said sorry, Ken Ham?
Yeah,
he doesn't disagree with the Luke's account in Acts.
No, I'm saying maybe I'm misunderstanding you. So forgive me if I'm not listening. I want to listen to learn, not listen to respond. My understanding of what you're saying is the Ken Ham example I gave is that Ken reconciles these things by inserting a hypothesis. Hey, what if Judas hung himself? His body got so bloated, and he fell. Right. And your other example was this like both and of a car hit someone and fell down the stairs, so both are true. And I'm saying, well, either one of those could be true, but we don't know which one would be if either of them at all. We just don't know.
And so the thing that separates us, what it's predicated on, is our trust and reliability of the scriptures.
I guess what I can add is if it's possible that they can both be true, then by definition it can't be a contradiction.
That's what I was saying.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right. So a contradiction can never both be true.
No.
Right.
Ever.
But we just don't know if that's the case in this story.
Well, but you just said that they could both be true, but it would be speculatory. I mean, speculative.
Speculative.
Right. Yeah, speculative.
Right.
But even theoretically, what Darren's saying, theoretically, a contradiction cannot theoretically be both true and
I would agree.
True.
Yeah.
So by definition, that would not be categorized as a contradiction. Then you get what I mean?
It's just two speculative accounts. You know what I mean? So you know what I mean? They could both be true. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you're good. I don't want to misunderstand. I think I follow. Maybe I'm too dumb.
Yeah. So I guess if it could be that the body rotted and fell, right?
Yeah.
Those two ideas don't contradict.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So if theoretically that happened, it's not a contradiction. If one happened, it's still not a contradiction because.
I guess that my point in saying contradiction is that on the surface these tell a story that are are not reconcilable to me on the surface, at least. Like, okay, this is
Interesting.
story B. Someone's lying, almost, was kind of the impression. Now, I don't believe that. I'm gonna be clear about that. But they don't seem, again, you asked like, what's a contradiction? To me, that is a contradiction. But maybe I'm not thinking about it in the right framework, and that's totally fair on my part.
Yeah,
So
I
just
think.
kinda
Well, I
about it.
think that that's very important. I teach my students about contradictions because
Mhm.
of that type of conclusion that we draw.
Mhm.
Where and specifically because of the scriptures, and it's a popular thing to say that the scriptures have so many contradictions, and typically when I hear that claim, I'm given maybe 2 or 3, and by definition they aren't contradictions. They are they're issues people might have with the text that they
Mhm.
maybe don't know how to reconcile, but
Yeah.
contradictions sell themselves. You can see it.
Like a married
Dude,
bachelor.
yeah. Yeah.
That's the old Ravi
Microsoft works.
Zacharias example.
Joking.
Microsoft
No,
works. Yeah, we
but,
agree there, right? Contradiction.
but
Yeah. Mhm.
oh man, Ravi, Lord have
I
mercy.
know.
But
It's a shame.
but yeah. And so a good example of that is understanding context. So some people think that a saved sinful person would be a contradiction, but because of what we know about what it means to be saved and what we know what it means to be sinful, that would not be a contradiction. That just needs to be fleshed out and
Mhm.
spelled out. Now,
Mhm.
if there are people who don't want to believe that, then yeah, they've got ammunition up the wazoo to be able to fight against believing that,
Mhm.
right? And the same thing is for any text. I think another popular one would be the grave, right? Jesus's tomb. Accounts of saying who showed up to the tomb, who
Right.
was it?
Right.
Was it Mary and the other ladies? Was it just Mary? I mean, and the question is, though, why does it have to be crystal clear? I think that if we are taking down works written by human beings, now you want speculation. Here's some speculation. If the Bible narrative was pristine, then that would be the charge waged against the scriptures. It's too pristine. Obviously, this is fake.
Yes. This is very interesting because I agree with a lot of what you just said. I really do. And again, maybe I'm drawing from my own experience here, and that in my experience is not the reality of maybe what is even true more broader than my own.
Yeah.
But I think one of the reasons why so many of us were looking for clarity, like you said, which I agree, the Bible oftentimes is not as clear as we would like it to be. Fair enough,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
And if we read the 4 gospel accounts on their surface, we do get 4 very different, at a minimum, tellings of the same story. I think at a minimum, okay. I mean, the we just decided a few. We can say that at a minimum. And so I think, though, one of the problems is, at least for me, when I was kind of taught my whole life, hey, the Bible is the moral rule book. The Bible is clear. God said it. That settles it. That kind of like very emphatic language of like, hey, man, just read this book and you're going to be good to go because God has spoken through it. And it's trustworthy in the sense of it's true, meaning not true in the sense of wisdom or the theological claims it makes, but like true in all the history it tells, etc. And then I started reading, I'm like, I'm confused. Like, which one, how do I reconcile this stuff? And then to maybe to your point, but then you start reading just the work of like biblical criticism by actual Christians, by the way, not just Bart Ehrman's, but actual Christians who love the Bible. And they're like, the archaeological evidence that we have of like the Battle of Jericho or the walls of Jericho coming down doesn't really match up with the biblical account. And you're like, oh, it doesn't? I was just kind of taught that like this whole history in the Torah is just the camcorder footage of what actually happened, but it doesn't match up with reality. So what do I do? So I gave you a lot, but I'm just trying to paint the picture that like, I agree with you. The Bible is not as clear as we'd like. It is mysterious in a lot of ways, and people argue over it all the time. And I think that's why a lot of us have kind of left some of that more fundamentalist thinking behind, because it didn't match up with what we were being told about the Bible.
So one comment about like say the Jericho thing. That's a good example, and it matters. I'm not going to open up that rabbit hole.
Sure.
But that's something that needs to be followed. You know what I mean? Like, so when someone makes that claim, hey, archaeological evidence says this, then now we need to follow it and see where it lands. And so I know that like listeners would be wondering, well, what is the conclusion about this thing you brought up with Jericho? Because today, as it stands, those findings are different regarding their coherence with Scripture and what Scripture says. Those findings are different. But that's not what I wanted to touch on. I know that was a little bit unfair for me to bring that up. But
no, that's fine. I didn't mean to give your audience something that maybe wouldn't be helpful for them. I was just giving you my experience out of that. So
no, yeah. So
to be misleading.
This is what I would say to that, you know, especially the person who's handing you the Bible, say, read it. You know, I don't know them, but just generally speaking, I mean, you were failed if that is the only response that you get. Because the fact of the matter is, Paul says this in Ephesians 4. He gave them apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ until we all attain to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Well, why? Why is he giving us gifts to build us up? Paul continues, so that we may no longer be children, tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by human cunning, by craftiness and deceitful schemes. It seems that there's a purpose for people in the church to teach and flesh things out and answer questions. So people who are shunning people who ask questions, or as you said, which is a thing, you're allowed to ask questions. You just have to land on the answers that they want. They're more concerned with you being in line with them than with what's true. If that's the case, that is not the DNA of a Christian. I'm not saying they're not Christians. It's just not the DNA of a Christian. That's not the DNA of the gifts given to the church for the purpose and to the glory of God. That's a failure on that part. And so,
when you say that something is, you talk a lot about truth. I understand that. When you say, you know, what is true, how do you think about that word? And then, like, what would be, is the Bible for you the source of said truth ultimately? Like, what does that mean for you? I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, I mean, that which conforms to reality, I think, is the most basic definition for truth.
Sure.
And yes, regarding the Bible, obviously that yes is far more simpler than I can answer it about the entire Bible. But an example is you take the creation account, right? My yes will be shot down by all the people saying, oh, but there's metaphor and there's poetic language and things like that. Like, yes, that's true. So then we need to get a bit more complex. But if we zoom out to the 10,000-foot view and we take the claim of the Bible regarding creation, hey, God made you from the dirt. He breathed his breath in you, and that's why you live. Well, then I would say, yeah, I believe that, because when we die, we breathe out and we turn to dirt. So I think it's pretty consistent, it seems.
Got it.
I don't see any evidence that says that I did come from this animal or things like that. And that evidence has been lacking for a long time now, for a very long time. But so that's what I mean by yes, I believe it. That which conforms to reality, and the Bible conforms to reality. Most important of which is what I discovered in college, that in my desires to do pious things, my desires to behave as someone who did grow up in this Christian context while eyes are watching me, but then when eyes aren't watching me, I'm at secrets.
I thought I've seen you there before. You look familiar, you know.
Listening to Tim jam on the pots there, but when they're not watching me, I'm doing that. There was something in me that told me, whatever it is I'm doing to try and appease whoever it is I'm appeasing, it's not working. It's not working. It's the Bible that tells me that even if I don't know it, my desire is to appease God and make him pleased with me. And I can't do it because I stand in opposition. I stand in enmity with him. And I need someone to stand in that gap for me. And that's so refreshing, because I can try to work myself off. I can try and do all that I can do. And at the end of the day, when I laid my head on my pillow, it didn't feel right. I still wasn't doing enough. And so the fact that there is a God man who came and did that for me conforms to my reality, that I needed someone to do that. I know I'm bad. The Bible tells me I'm bad. That conforms to reality. And so because of all these things, and because of the fact that it definitely has stood the test of time, whether or not somebody can come with a claim about Jericho or not. I mean, we're talking about millennia. It stood the test of time. sidebar, going back to the fact that we don't have original manuscripts, nothing in antiquity. We don't have any original
Totally. No,
manuscripts.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, the New Testament's the most well-sourced document in antiquity, no doubt about that.
100%. 100%.
Yep.
And so all of these things lining up, therefore, I trust what it says.
Yeah.
I trust that even that which I don't see and haven't seen conforms to reality, that God, Jesus, will come again. He'll crack the sky as judge and king, and he'll call me friend. And I can find hope in that.
Yeah.
I can trust it. And then there's the fact that my character is conforming to his. And I know for a fact I'm not doing anything to make that happen.
Yeah.
It's him transforming me constantly
Yeah.
through his spirit. So, yes, that's my definition of truth.
Where
and
do
yes,
you
the Bible
find
fits it?
No, and I listen, I'm truly I'm thrilled for you. Honestly, I really am. I think that's powerful. And I recognize a lot of that language myself. And I understand a lot of where it comes from in my own life. I'm curious, I've always wanted to ask someone with like your position in this. I understand that what you said several times is how you define truth. This has been true for you, and that's great. Where do you find the balance of the typical, well, this is a very true belief for me that I hold as true and believe, versus now other people need to believe it or else kind of language, right? So, I mean, obviously we're talking about metaphysical things, we're talking about theology and God, and what's the old saying? If I fully understood God, I'd be God, right? There is some level of mystery automatically to all of this. Doesn't matter how you break it down. So how do you navigate that balancing act of like, hey, this is a really powerful belief and truth, and I can defend that, why I think that's true, but also realizing that, and this, right? The Christian tradition's big, the Catholic, Eastern Orthodox traditions, the Protestant tradition, it's very big, and people are not going to see it the exact same way that you do on all these issues. How do you like balance that for you versus making room for other people and different perspectives?
Well, one, that or else thing isn't us. I think Christians who adopt the or else are coming from probably a maybe not the greatest of places. However, there is an or else. It's just not mine. So I just want to, and let me back up real quick.
Sure.
There was an apologist named Philip Dodridge, and he opened up a treatise at one point saying this. And this is before he started going through an apologetic on the reality of God and his existence and how we can know he exists. But he says, I desire to you to know this, that there is no evidence so satisfactory to the true believer than have felt the power of the life-saving gospel on his own soul. And the reason that stood out to me is because if I know that my motivation in sharing what is true in the scripture is rooted in love, when I can be patient and have grace for somebody who doesn't accept it the same way I once didn't. And now that I've felt the power of the life-saving gospel on my own soul, it's naive and it's also misguided of me to impose that on someone rather than share it, that they would also receive that same power. And Paul says that we ought to share it unapologetically. This is not verbatim. It's Romans 1. I'm not ashamed of the gospel, he says, for it's the power of God. And so it's not my power, it's God's power. And so I don't need to be ashamed of it. He also says in Ephesians that, look, I was dead, dead in my sins, I was. So therefore, I'm saved by faith through grace, by grace through faith. I'm saved. That means that I did absolutely nothing to receive what I'm sharing. So when I'm sharing with somebody, if I come to Tim and I say, look, Tim, this is why this is true. I'm sharing as somebody who's just as blind as you were, but there were people who were relentlessly sharing with me. But I also need to recognize that there's patience, there's grace, and there is the power of God that needs to work, not me, not my argumentation, not my structuring, not my articulation, not my timing. But I'm very grateful that there were people who were faithful enough to call me out, to be patient with me, to encourage me, to admonish me. I'm very grateful for that because I know it's the truth. They knew it was the truth, but they, in addition to sharing it with me, trusted and prayed for my soul that I would come and see it for be the truth. And there is no greater evidence, as Philip Dodridge says, than to have felt that power on your own soul.
Awesome. Thank you. That's really helpful.
Yeah, man. So let's look at this real quick. What time
All
are
right.
we at? 40 minutes. Okay.
My kids are asleep, bro. You do what you want.
Yeah, mine are too.
Is that why you do it so late?
That's 100% why.
Yeah,
You got 4 kids.
Yeah.
I've got 3. Yeah.
Say no more.
That's exactly why. That's exactly why. So this is what the post was. We introduced ourselves on a on an Instagram post, and this is, oh shoot, I didn't even take a proper screenshot. But here's the caption.
All right.
G.K. Chesterton was a really interesting thinker. He wrote a lot about progressivism as it was emerging at the time, and he said, "Progress is just a neutral word. It simply means that you are going to a place." You're walking down a path and you are probably walking down the wrong path. So you are actually progressing in the wrong direction. Just because you're making progress on something doesn't mean it's a positive thing. So now I think that actual statement is a quote from Elisa Childers, maybe from our episode. You have to forgive me because we didn't post this. Our media team posted it. It's our podcast and I love that post. But I'm just saying, I don't have the right thinking about the context here because I didn't post it. And so this is what you responded with. Reminder, it wasn't progressive Christianity that stormed our Capitol on January 6th. So there are a couple things that I'm interested in knowing. One, do you identify as a progressive Christian?
Truly, not really. I mean, I'm in that world ultimately because I deal in more progressive ideas, but none of our branding, quote unquote, I don't ever say I'm Tim, the progressive Christian. It's not really the language I use. But if I had to pick between these two, camps of thought, I would be more in the progressive camp for sure.
Okay. Now, secondly, pause that, Darren. I'm going to pause this and I'm going to take a pee real quick.
Oh, great.
What? In sanctification and all of these things, we want to make progress in those things. But there's a big difference between me progressing in my understanding and knowledge of the eternal truths of God's word and then believing that those eternal truths themselves are progressing. And I think that starts to get to the heart of what the main difference is between progressive Christianity and what I call historic Christianity. It's like,
got it.
So that's the one. Can you imagine? If somebody came out,
you guys had Dr. Crenshaw on here? That's funny.
Yes.
I talked to her before too. Interesting.
Oh, maybe that's not what you commented on. I don't know, bro. I can't find it.
Hey, man, I'll follow you wherever you want to go with this. I'm totally fine with it. I'm totally fine. I can riff.
But yeah, so but that's that you said that progressive Christianity wasn't the one who attacked the Capitol on January 6th or whatever.
Yes, that's right.
What ideology did attack the Capitol?
The New Apostolic Reformation.
Oh, wow. That's something we disagree with, but expound.
I mean, well, there's data on this. I mean, I can give you entire studies that have all the receipts. Matthew Taylor's work on this is probably the person to look up. But I mean, the New Apostolic Reformation was one of the groups behind what stoked the fires that led to January 6th. I mean, plus just the icon. I always get this word wrong. Is it iconography? Like the icon imagery. I mean, when you have a Christian flag parading through the Senate building, you have a prayer to Jesus, thanking him for the opportunity. You have Jesus is my president, or is my savior. Trump is my president. You have the Virgin Mary statues of that was paraded around. So I don't know how else to say. I mean, I can give you example after example of conservative Christian evangelical leaders who were there, who support it, who now downplay it. Stucky, who Elisa Childers is a big fan of, she's doing an event with her. She had someone on her podcast spreading the conspiracy that the police are probably behind it. There's absolutely no evidence of that.
Well, I don't. She said no evidence of it because I didn't follow it closely, but I at least saw that was on the news.
What? That the police were behind the January 6th insurrection?
The idea that not just the police, but the FBI.
Yeah, I would need actual sources from actual news data on that because everything I've read and seen,
would you need eyewitness sources?
I would need data. I would not need the shaman telling me the police were behind it. He would be an eyewitness source. I don't trust him. So no, I would. Data would be people who have studied this, who have looked over the footage, who have done maybe the congressional testimony, like the police officers who were there, who testified what was actually happening. And this is actually an interesting conversation because I don't want to cut you off.
Really quick. Do you trust our government?
More than I trust January 6th insurrectionists.
Oh, okay. Well, that's where we fundamentally disagree.
You trust January 6th insurrectionists more than our government?
We trust neither.
We trust neither.
No,
At
we
all.
trust neither, man.
We don't know those
Interesting.
people, and we don't know our government.
Now, this
but we
is so
do know our
fascinating.
government.
This is so fascinating because earlier talking about truth, you
Yeah.
had no problem putting your stake in the ground on understanding a collection of books that are 2,000 years removed from us at a minimum. Okay, I'm not saying there isn't good evidence to believe what you believe, but you stuck the truth claim there. But when it comes to something that we can actually verify, we can watch footage of, we can actually examine for our own eyes, we can read studies on January 6th, and our government reports on that, your response was, I don't trust our government. That's a very interesting thing to me.
You're proving our point right now, baby. So you got what you're saying?
I'm gathering it.
All right, let me. One, the claims that are 2,000 years old are claims made by eyewitnesses. That's important. Not only that, they're historical claims made by eyewitnesses written down during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses. That's important because I can say right now, hey, I can write a book. So like, yeah, man, January 6th was crazy. Everybody went there with super soakers and Bible started praying for everybody. People would immediately write books and say, he's lying. He's not telling the truth. That's not what we see in the biblical record. That's not what we see in antiquity when it comes down to the things written down regarding the Bible and the scriptures. So that's significantly different. Not only do they make these claims by eyewitnesses in a lifetime of eyewitnesses, they do it with falsifiable statements. I'm talking about statements of the Gospels that open up and say, in the reign of Governor Quirinius, when this was happening, this, and this. It's falsifiable. Since they're writing it down during a lifetime of eyewitnesses, how come no one stepped up and said this is not true? In the ultimate claim of Jesus' resurrection, they could have easily said this is not true. Rather, they spent their time spinning their heads trying to figure out how they can explain his missing body.
I understand all of those arguments. That isn't my point. My point is that you have no, it seemed like you were very quick for your reasons given to stake your claim in truth in that. But when we talked about something that happened 3 years ago that we can actually give data on and again prove is true.
Wait, what are you saying? Are you thinking we're saying
you said
we
that you didn't trust
that happened?
Well, you said you didn't trust your government when I brought up that police testified in front of Congress about what actually happened, and we had an entire 5 or 6 day hearing on January 6th where they aired all the testimony, all of the deep findings, and your response was, I don't trust our government. So I'm thinking, well, how come you're so quick to dismiss that, but you're so firm on, again, I'm not saying you don't have good evidence, but it's just funny seeing what you have no problem saying, no, truth here in this thing, but the government, I can't trust that report that just came out. I'm like, what do you mean?
Our government has given us evidence that they're liars often.
Sometimes.
Conspiracy all throughout our government, the history of our country.
Yeah, but that's not talking about what happened on January 6th with that committee.
Well,
and
it's
again,
a principle. If there is an agenda, whatever it is, it can be right or a left agenda. It doesn't matter what it is. Our government has unlimited funds to push towards it. Our media is truthful.
How do you think that a congressional hearing on January 6th, full of hundreds of hours of witness testimony and video footage, is somehow your government lying to you? I'm not saying the government's always trustworthy. I have major problems with the government, of course, and yes, I'm not going to go into the history of, obviously, as we know about the government and other issues in our country's history. But on this issue regarding January 6th, right? I'm just saying we have maybe a Mount Everest-sized amount of data that shows us what happened, some of the groups that were behind it, who was tried, and what the motivation was. And surprising, shocker alert, it wasn't the police, it wasn't the FBI, it was militia groups and people deeply committed to their faith, taking back the country for God. And there's evidence about that. So I'm not sure why the move is, I just trust the government. Yeah, me too, but not on this.
Well, hold on, let's dead that real quick, because I think those were kind of separate questions responding, and it's turned into this thing that seems like we are making a claim that January 6th never happened. Now, we probably have different ideas on what happened there, but our ideas also come from, what do you call data? Comes from data.
What do you think happened on January 6th?
I think a bunch of people who don't have hope thought that because of the threat of the election being stolen, that was their final hope being left. And so they decided to do something about it. I think that there were also people who were complicit in that people who were also stoking the flames on that on purpose. And then finally, I think that majority of the people walked into a building they as citizens own. That's what I think.
Do you think that the 2020 election was stolen?
I think there's a lot of evidence to prove that there was.
Yeah.
There was
What
a lot of
evidence
eyewitness
would that be?
testimony and affidavits of people speaking before hearings and saying their claims. How do we prove them wrong?
Well, does it concern you that out of 61 lawsuits that were filed by the Trump administration, 60 were defeated in a court, and that Rudy Giuliani, Trump's own lawyers, admitted on the record that they weren't fighting election fraud? Does that concern you at all? Does it concern you that Dominion voting machines won an $800 million lawsuit against Fox News for them pushing a false narrative that Dominion voting machines were changing their votes automatically overnight? Does it concern you that Trump's own Supreme Court threw out his election fraud case? I mean, these affidavits you're talking about all have context. And there's a reason why courts, including, by the way, judges appointed by Trump, threw out 60 out of 61 cases. And one more thing I'll give you. I'm not sure if you're aware of Dinesh D'Souza's documentary, 2000 Mules, that came out. Yeah, Salem Media Group just recanted that whole documentary for being false. The actual media group that pushed it out recanted it because they were going to be sued for defamation. And they said, okay, you're right. There's false evidence in here, things we couldn't substantiate. We're recanting it. So I need better evidence than there's an affidavit somewhere, because I don't know how else to explain that there's no widespread election fraud. It's been proven time and time again. And it concerns me when I hear Christians who, again, love to talk about truth and being firm on truth, can't look what's right in front of them. I mean, you can read the court cases yourself. You can hear Giuliani say it himself. There was no, we're not fighting an election fraud case in court, Your Honor. I'm sorry. That's just the data.
So the whole truth thing, it seems like there's some like animosity because we care about truth.
No,
but we'll still disagree about things. I'm talking about generally speaking, because you're not. This isn't new. We've heard this before, especially when it comes down to if January 6th was one. Before January 6th, it was COVID, right? If you have a different stance, or if you think differently about things, or if you have questions about things, then you're a part of this deplorable bag of nonsense. But I think that if you care about truth, then you're willing to ask questions. And I think one of the things that really stoked the flames of January 6th is that asking questions was slanderable. It was slanderable. If you asked questions about what happened here, what's going on here, then it was cast aside and the answers weren't being given to people. So I don't know for a fact what happened with the election. I know that Biden is our president now, and I have no passion about it. I'm not that passionate about it because I have hope no matter who our president is. And it turns out that as time goes on, our pickings get slimmer and slimmer when it comes down to whatever side you want to pick. So I don't place any hope in that. But I do have opinions about those days. And we have opinions about these things. So in general, what Darren was saying was we don't have that. Our trust and reliance isn't on the government in general. In general. So if somebody says, hey, the government lied about this, then we're like, okay, well, show us. We're open to it. But what will typically happen is if somebody says, hey, the government's lying about this, then people respond, that's ridiculous. And we're just saying, oh, we don't think that's ridiculous. People lie all the time.
Yeah. I know I'm on your podcast, so I want to make sure can I push you a little bit on this? Is that okay? Do I have permission to okay, I just want to make sure I know we don't know each other personally yet, so
it's all good.
I guess what I'm struggling with here is earlier you mentioned that for you, and I would agree, truth is something that corresponds to reality. I agree with you 100%. And so what I'm struggling with in this particular context, not in the concept that the government lies. Yes, of course, the government lies. In the context of the election fraud narrative, what I'm saying is we have tons of data that corresponds to reality. We have tons of it. We have
like what?
I just gave you several things. I gave you that Trump's own team admitted there was no election fraud case actually taking place inside the courts. I told you about the Dominion voting machine lawsuit that got in favor of Dominion voting machine. I told you about Dinesh D'Souza's documentary being recanted by its own media group for having false information. I told you about the 61 lawsuits and how 60 of them were thrown out by.
That sounds like consequences. Yeah,
but what I'm saying is that the data shows there was actually no widespread election fraud. Ballots were recounted many times. This all happened. And so I'm struggling with, I agree. Truth has to correspond to reality. It seems to me, based on the available evidence, that this is a truth that corresponds to reality. But I feel like on this issue in particular, you're like, well, maybe, I just don't know. I'm like, well, what do you mean you don't know? We can verify this. Like, just like how we can say the earth is round, not flat. How do we know? Well, we can verify that through math and going out to outer space.
We believe it's flat.
Oh no! Oh no!
I'm joking.
I gotta go. I'm just saying, like this is a very, to me, verifiable claim that we can put a stake on the ground and say, no, Trump, you're actually wrong here. The data says otherwise, and your own team even admitted so. So to me, it's pretty cut and dry to me. I'm not sure why we have to bring nuance to this particular issue.
Well, you know, it's not nuance. It's still talking about the data. I think we just disagree on which data. So is it data that it was known that Nancy Pelosi knew or was made aware of an attempt to do something at the Capitol? And
that's been debunked, but okay. It's been debunked, man. I'm not sure what to say. You know,
well, that's what I'm saying, and that's why this is a different type of. I don't think it's verifiable. I think it's conjecture. Okay. That's what it is. It turns into conjecture. So if Trump's team says this one thing and this person says this, that's quite literally he said, she said. It's not verifiable.
Do you think that like the truth is knowable in our current reality? Can we know truth?
Yeah, 100%. Truth is objective. Yeah.
So there is an objective. So either either the election was or wasn't stolen. We just don't know. Ultimately, is that kind of your?
No, thesis? I think we can know. I mean, I don't know. Okay. And I'm not willing to put my flag and say it was. I know that there are people who are, but I'm not. But I think people get riled up over the fact that I'm not putting my flag and saying it wasn't.
Sure.
I think that's what people get riled up over.
Yeah.
But
cool. I appreciate that, and thanks for the good conversation. I love good debate.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're about to have another quick one, real quick.
Oh boy.
Because you talked about the truth, because at least you referenced it for us. Sure. Yeah. When it comes down to your personal ethic and personal conviction regarding sex, sexuality, and in conjunction with your faith. Mm-hmm. How does that reconcile? When did that start? How did you get there?
Yes. Do you want the biblical argument for why I believe what I believe, or just kind of my personal experience? They're kind of separate a little bit.
Well, I mean,
started with one.
If you're arguing from the Bible, that would supersede your thing.
I'm trying to, I guess, meet you on like your terms as well. I know that we both hold the Bible in high authority, and I want to make sure that we're on the same page with that. You know, yeah. I mean, ultimately, maybe this is an oversimplification because you tend to be in this world, and you're probably used to the arguments, but I just took the text seriously and realized that the biblical sexual ethic is all over the place and is not consistent from beginning to end. Mm-hmm. And that was the beginning of like, well, maybe it's not as cut and dry as I was taught. And then like many things that we tend to interpret today for many different reasons, after just listening to other voices who are also know their stuff and who are maybe biblical scholars or historical scholars, have come to the conclusion that at least as far as how we understand same-sex sex in the ancient world compared to today, it's just two different things. There's no really category for a same-sex monogamous relationship or something like that. So that's kind of how I got there in a nutshell.
So explain, give me an example of the first part. So like, all right, step one. Oh, the biblical sexual ethic is all over the place. What were you reading, and what happened? Where was that light bulb?
So just for sake of argument, let's assume that Genesis 2, Adam and Eve are two historical creatures or beings that were the first humans ever to exist. Mm-hmm. So I mean, right off the bat, we have an incest problem to repopulate the earth. So already we're into some weird territory.
What do you mean by incest?
Well, if Adam and Eve were the first ever two humans to live, and we all descended from them, at some point, family sleeping with family to keep populating. At some point,
are you saying that's wrong?
Well, I would say that is wrong, even though the Bible doesn't really condemn incest technically.
On what basis would that be wrong?
Well, hold on, I'm giving you I know the argument you're going to go into. You're going to get me into the morality clause, but you're asking how I got there. And I'm starting with the foundation of the Bible's not clear sexually. Because then in Genesis 4, Lamech takes two wives. The text never condemns that. Israel takes his cousins who are two sisters and their servant, and the nation of Israel is born through them. David takes 8 wives, and Nathaniel prophesying on behalf of God says that God gave him those wives. So I'm just saying, I'm not going to argue with you on how we get to immorality. I'm just saying the biblical text.
What was that last one?
David having 8 wives, and when David rapes Bathsheba, and Nathaniel prophesying on behalf of God, God says, "Did I not give you Saul's wives? Was that not enough for you?" So we have this story of God giving David multiple wives. So I'm just giving the example that, again, like, it's just not a very clear cut. God designed marriage for one man and for one woman. And then we can even go deeper at the scholarship. So now I'm citing Dr. Jennifer Bird. She's
well, I wouldn't say that's deeper. That's more shallow.
Well, I was going to go deeper now about how the language.
No, I was saying that if you are giving a biblical argument and then you go into scholarly, I think you're going up. That's shallow. That's more surface.
You think scholarly work is shallower than what?
Than biblical arguments?
What's the difference?
What the text says?
Well, that's what biblical scholars do. They're trained to read the text.
Well, let's hear what you're about to say.
Well, I mean, let's back up. I mean, do you know who John Walton is? He's a pretty conservative.
Yeah.
All right. So he says that the Bible was written for us, but not to us. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. 100%.
Okay. Right. So we need people who can really understand the world of the Bible to better tell us what's going on inside of it. Is that a fair statement?
That is a fair statement. However, it doesn't mean that they're the only ones who know how.
Listen, I'm not arguing that point. I'm just saying that there is a world of academic scholarship that studies this stuff very deeply on a very deep level. We can disagree with it, but it is a thing.
Oh, I'm familiar with the academy. I'm just saying that if I were to, because all I was saying, it was a very general surface level statement. What you just finished doing is you finished quoting text,
right?
To me,
yeah,
and then you were about to start giving me people's thoughts.
Yeah,
I was saying, but in a general sense, that's actually more shallow. I'm not saying it's shallow, but I'm saying it's not as weightier as the quoted text is all.
Interesting. Gotcha. Well, I think it's an interesting point that, like, I guess my ultimate thesis is that in the biblical notion, almost nothing of our modern marriage relationship besides sex difference really carries over. So meaning like, well, I mean, this is like, for example, there's no actual word for husband or wife in the Greek or Hebrew. It's always man or woman. Yeah. And the language is that a man takes his woman. It's the same language that Adam took of the fruit. There's not really a consent ethic of, mutuality in the scriptures over and over again. So I'm just showing, well, I'm just saying it's not a clear picture. So you could go to Paul here and say about mutual submission and that part, but that would not be in line with some of the early Torah understandings of what it meant to be.
I don't agree that there's mutual submission.
Okay, well, whatever you might agree with then. Again, these things are debated, right? So you might say that and someone else might say something differently. So
I get it.
I'm just saying that, like, the Bible is not very monolithic on the nature of sex when someone is married, and then what that relationship might or might not look like. It's all kind of all over the place. Is my ultimate conclusion.
So yeah, and so like as a claim, that being a claim that the Bible is all over the place, that is where the conformity to reality would matter, right? Here's a conformity to reality. It's like, okay, the sexual ethic is all over the place. The Bible does confirm that babies are a result of sex. Babies are a result of only a specific type of sex. So that's an evidential thing. It seems that the Bible also claims that the purpose of sex is to glorify God. Would you say it does not?
Which one of David's 8 wives was glorifying God when he was sleeping with them then?
Well, so what you're doing in the beginning, even when you started this, you were talking about something that doesn't condemn, or you're saying something that happens in a biblical narrative and it doesn't condemn it.
Yeah, I mean, again, God gave David those 8 wives.
Let's go with that. So, but what we're doing is, even in what you just said, as far as the Bible's written to us, I mean, for us, not to us. In addition to that, is we also need to know in hermeneutics, what are we reading? What's the purpose of it? You know this, the different genres of scripture and how we read it. And so let's go back to where you started in Genesis, where all these things are happening. And you're saying, well, the Bible doesn't condemn that after it happens. The Bible doesn't condemn that after it happens. So let's rewind real quick. The Bible says that man fell and will surely die. It implicitly says that there are aspects about us that are decaying, and then it proceeds to show humanity decay in these actions you're even talking about. So I think that's something that needs to be weighed equally. You don't agree with that?
I would just like you to give me the section of the biblical text that blatantly condemns polyamory for the sake of polyamory. There's condemnations for Saul taking multiple wives of different nations, but that's never explicit in the text. You have to assume that. Last thing I'll say about this, and I'll get back to you. Yeah. Genesis 2 happens before the fall. So if Adam and Eve were set up before the fall and they were having babies.
Why'd you say that?
What?
Well, you lost me real quick.
Oh, because you said earlier how the fall happened, and that's a symptom of all these unhealthy sexual relationships. Did I understand you correctly?
Well, the sexual relationships is a symptom of the fall. Yeah.
Right. But Genesis 2 happens before the fall, right?
How is that indicative of some type of bad thing? Genesis 2.
Oh, I guess what I'm saying is, do you think, I mean, this kind of speculation on my part, do you think that in Genesis 2, before the fall happened, Adam and Eve were having kids at that point? Maybe okay. So, I mean, hypothetically.
Oh, you're throwing the incest in there. Is what
if it happened long enough, it would happen before the fall. It wasn't a problem.
Yeah. Well, and the only reason I was asking about the incest thing, which I could have gone the morality route like you were talking about, is I'm talking about our modern view. I think you are reading your modern view of incest, which is condemned. Israel is forbidden from doing that. But our modern view of incest into a reading of the creation of the first man and woman, which by definition, they're siblings. They come from the same father. They come from the same father. Adam and Eve don't. They don't come from the same father.
The same father?
Yeah.
What do you like? God you're talking about?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Well, I don't hold to a literal creation narrative of Adam and Eve being literal figures.
Okay, Jesus does, but Jesus does.
No, he cites his biblical he cites his tradition, which is Adam and Eve. They could be seen as archetypes. It means the language is the human and the life. That's what those two are ringing. And the word Adam is a non-gendered thing. It just means the human. Man. Dude, this. I mean, I can give you sources if you want them, but
I'm sure
what's going on.
It's not that I'm hearing this for the first time.
I'm sure you're not. I'm sure you're not. I'm not surprised.
It's just that there's a lot being thrown out as if they are irrefutable oppositions to what the biblical text says.
Oh, I don't think that. I just think that these are more compelling understandings of those texts. I mean, I understand the other side. I grew up in it my whole entire life. I find that when someone actually knows Hebrew and knows the context of Hebrew culture and can say, look, this word is what it actually means. Here's what it means in this context. I take their authority more than, for example, a John MacArthur telling me what Genesis 1 or 2 means. Personally.
Well, let's do it. I don't hold John MacArthur in low light.
I figured I would just go somewhere that's maybe more generic. So
okay, yeah, that's fine. I mean, you might have a vendetta against John MacArthur.
I do. He protects pedophiles, so I have a vendetta against him.
He does what?
He protected 2 men who were pastors on his staff who molested their own children.
Oh well, I have nothing about that. That's okay. So
yikes.
So what I'm doing is we're gonna look really quickly. Sorry, you weren't looking at that whole time. Where am I, Darren?
You're terrible.
Windows. I know. Oh, there we are. Let's do that. Can you see?
Mm-hmm.
All right. We're in Genesis 1.
Uh-huh.
Then God said, let us make man, Adam, in our image and after our likeness.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're saying is this is non-gendered.
Mm-hmm.
But what does it mean to be gendered when he's literally creating gender?
It's the human. That's the like most bare bones interpretation you can get. Let us make humanity or the human in our image.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
it doesn't say man. It's human. It's a non-gender description. It's like saying all of mankind. We're not talking about the genitalia or the gender of all of humanity. We're talking about the broad idea of mankind.
But it expounds on that here. So after all of that, here's the conclusion and the summary. Mm-hmm. God created man in his own image. Salam, in his image of God, he created him. Male and female.
Mm-hmm.
He created them.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're saying is with that plain reading, in addition to what you were saying about the speculative nature of, what was it, Luke, and the way that we're rationalizing how people could get around that, you're saying that your stance on the Genesis narrative is straightforward and we're the ones going in a roundabout way?
Not my stance. I would just say what I read.
You're a proponent. You're a
Jen Bird,
proponent
Dan
of a snake.
McClellan, people like that. Yeah, I mean, I would hold to their understandings of these texts in their original language, as best as we know how, over the English. This happens all the time.
Yeah. I mean, that was the Hebrew we were just looking at.
Yeah, but I'm not a Hebrew scholar. I trust Hebrew scholars to help me interpret this stuff. Just like how I don't trust myself to diagnose my own illnesses. I trust my doctor to do that. Right.
That's great.
Right.
That's great.
So I fully admit I appeal to authority here 100%. You know, I appeal to the most credible authority that I can find and read as widely as I can.
Well, there are plenty of Hebrew scholars who disagree with that. I would probably assume, and this is a big assumption, because this is a big assumption.
Yeah.
But I would assume that the ones who have the stance that you were talking about are in the minority.
They could be.
They could be.
I don't know.
I think that's worthy of that's worthy of taking notes. Doesn't mean they're wrong.
I would totally agree.
Worthy of weighing and taking note. But so let's progress.
I love this stuff, man. It's I enjoy the study and the wrestling and the going back and forth and I enjoy it. It's a great point.
Right. But here's the thing. The wrestling, it ought not be for wrestling's sake. It should be for landing and submitting to what's true ultimately.
But okay, I guess a question I would ask then is, and let me just say, I fully acknowledge and agree with you that, like, I mean, for every one person who has a view, you can find a different credible voice with a different view, right? So, so what I'm saying, isn't that what we're talking about here with like this whole Adam thing? I cited some sources, you say you disagree. Here's some other sources, and we go around. We go.
But the last thing I pointed out was that they're in the minority. So that means,
well, you think that they are. I'm not sure.
I would, yeah. That's you're right. You're absolutely right.
But even if but to be fair, Mike Winger, for example, I know for a fact is in the minority on some major issues. That doesn't stop evangelicals from taking his view over others. So a minority position isn't inherently good or bad. I think what I'm asking is, I agree with you to a point, but then you get into this, we have to submit to the truth. I'm like, well, okay, then which one is the truth, and how would you know?
Well, you didn't let me finish. When I was talking about submitting to the truth, it's like this idea of open-mindedness is seen as inherently good for the sake of being open-minded. I think you have an open mind so that it takes you to where you close it. An open mind is willing to go where the evidence is leading. I feel like when someone is reading that Hebrew and they are inserting our modern understanding of gender and gender, I don't know, identity or whatever, or anything that could make a conversation about this being a gender neutral term significant, which is modern, it's 100% modern. That is most certainly an roundabout way of doing hermeneutics in Genesis. It's roundabout. And then also to then say that Jesus, who is the Word of God, with God, and is God, is merely hearkening back to a tradition, the same tradition he slanders Pharisees for, the traditions of their fathers, rather than holding to the biblical teaching. I think that is a much bigger roundabout way of approaching it. And I think it's, we can deal with it and wrestle with it, but if we're honestly taking it where it leads us, I don't think it leads us there. I think you have to insert that Jesus is merely addressing tradition as God himself. You called him God. So what we read in Genesis, Jesus is there and he's hearkening back to tradition. Why would he rely on tradition when he is the one from whom tradition stems?
Well, Jesus was also a Jewish man who grew in knowledge, the scripture says. So he obviously has a major part of his humanity that grew over time. He's still steeped in the cultural context. Well, all I was saying was that Jewish growing up as a Jewish man, as a rabbi, would be steeped in his religious traditions text. Yeah. Adam and Eve are part of the Jewish tradition. That's all I'm saying. That's obviously, we both agree that even the Torah, as we understand it, wasn't the same exact thing that Jesus is riffing off of, let alone the whole canonized English Protestant Bible. So we have to keep that in mind. Like, he's in a different context than ours. Right. So that was my only comment.
And I appreciate that. And I don't want to seem nitpicky, but I
no, I don't mind it at all. I love it. I really do. I really do. I love this stuff.
What you highlighted was that Jesus grew in knowledge. And yes, I mean, I think that that's something incredible to think that the King of Glory was potty trained. It's mind-boggling.
100%.
However, he taught at 12. And he wowed the teachers in the synagogue at 12.
Sure.
And I love in that passage when it talks about them leaving them behind which I'm sure made a lot of bad parents feel comfortable and understood. But
yeah,
leaving them behind in the synagogue, and hey, Jesus, why'd you do that? Where'd you go? Didn't you know I'd be in my father's house teaching, giving them this business? Didn't you know that? And then it says that he went home and submitted to them. And I love that language to show that he didn't need to.
Yeah.
But there's an aspect of humanity that glorifies God when we honor our mother and our father. And Jesus willingly did that. I'm highlighting that to say that this idea of his humanity doesn't mean that he wasn't God during that. And so,
right.
And his teaching in the synagogue at 12 reflects that. It reflects that he had wisdom that surpassed those who were there to teach. So he very well could have done it at 12. And what the passage that I'm addressing, when he refers back to Adam and Eve and marriage, he's talking about divorce
there. Yeah. And then he goes into eunuchs, which is a very interesting passage.
He's a grown man. It's during that whole big teaching in Matthew.
Yeah.
So I just don't think that that's a plausible argument, that he still had some other things to learn. He was relying on tradition. It's just not a plausible argument.
I really do. I think that one of the most, maybe one of the most beautiful parts about the belief that we both agree on, that Jesus is God incarnate, God in the flesh, is how Jesus comes into this earth, right? Through the most humble means. He lives a poverty level life. I mean, being a carpenter was not a rich life. And it's like, wow, the God of all creation, the God who spoke it all into existence, doesn't come through power or might or through a king or through taking the emperor or the empire, but like in the most subversive, under the empire's boot kind of way. I just think that's like a very compelling God to think about, that is so confident that this God says, you know what, why don't I just come through the most meek and mild and humble way possible? I think that's amazing.
I agree. I agree with you. Look, this is my question. I'll ask you to finish.
Okay.
What is the gospel, and is it worth sharing?
The gospel is the good news that Christ is reconciling all things to himself, ultimately, and that we have the option to participate in that reconciliation.
What does that mean?
Well, I love how Tim Mackey puts it. He talks a lot about how there's this thread in the biblical narrative generally of like wisdom, and how do we partner with the wisdom of God to essentially get rid of the hell on earth that demonic forces work with humanity to do, just essentially sow cycles of chaos on the earth. And I like that a lot. I think it really grounds things in the here and now, because that's why I think so many of Christ's teachings, and of course the Bible in many ways, is so helpful in that. And I also think on the eschatological, how do you say it?
Eschatological.
Thank you. I think on that level, the good news is that at the end of the day, death does not have the final say, that death has lost its sting. I think that's a very compelling belief to hold on to, in the hope that one day all of the crooked, that's what sin is, right? Missing the mark, the crookedness of the world, all the injustice that we couldn't fix or that we couldn't solve here, ultimately gets reconciled and gets taken care of.
How does injustice get taken care of?
Which kind?
Any. I mean, how does the reality of injustice?
I don't know, man. I mean, how do cremated bodies come back to life?
Oh, God has power.
I know, but I don't know how it works. I'm just saying it's a
I don't know.
I can't tell you how injustice gets quenched. I don't know.
Tim, come on, man.
I don't know. So, like, ultimately, I don't know.
Well, one thing I'll say is that's actually where what you were explaining about Tim Mackey, which I mean, that Bible Project has done incredible work.
Love their stuff. Huge fan.
But I actually diverge from him when he starts talking about that thing. I think it's because of the gaps left in the beauty of Jesus's penal substitutionary atonement. That's where we go away. That's where we go astray. It's necessary. It is necessary. But I thank you for answering that question.
Of course.
But
I have a question for you.
Yes.
Am I a Christian?
Do you believe that Jesus is your substitution, your sacrifice, and that your sins are laid up on his cross with him, and his righteousness has been given to you, and that he died and was raised again to life?
In my own way, yes. I can say yes. I'm not getting into. I don't subscribe to PSA. Let me just say that right out of the gate. And many
here's the thing, bro. So. Here's the thing. I know it's because we talk about it in this modern world. We're doing podcasts, which is incredible. Yeah. But at the end of the day, the truth will matter. It's like you talked about. I find that beautiful too. That the King of Glory chose to come through a birth canal. Mm-hmm. How humbling. in a manger. How humbling.
Yeah.
With no home. How humbling to be stretched on a cross like a criminal after being beaten, slapped, and slandered.
Totally.
And then called king in a mocking way. How humbling.
100%.
But he's not coming back on a donkey. He's not coming back on a donkey. And that's the only reason why injustice here is set good. Because either injustice here is set straight through Christ, and that's my injustice. The injustice that I've committed, that Darren's committed, that you have committed. Our injustice is dealt with when we trust in Christ, and that is placed on him. Those stripes he bears. But then the injustice that continues, I just read a story about a woman stabbing a 3-year-old in a grocery store. And all these other things that happen in this world where things need to be set right. Our hearts desire them to be set right. That's missing in what you described. If God is just reconciling all things, it's missing because justice involves punishment. It inherently involves punishment. That's what justice involves.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's restorative justice and there's punitive justice, and both
100%.
Right, I believe in more restorative justice. Ultimately.
Well, yeah, but we've got evil happening. You talked.
I don't disagree. I mean, that's what makes the cross so powerful.
Evil by definition exists in a context where justice must be punitive. It must be.
Or okay, I mean, we can debate this a different day. I mean, or is the love of God so powerful that it cleanses humans who partner with evil? I mean, is that an option too? Like restorative justice is a very valid framework for some.
And look how full circle we just came. It seems like it's both and.